quite a star-studded session, and not only with regard to the caliber of the presenters, but also the exciting topic that will be presented to us. Blessing in the Desert, Hélder, Câmara, and the Nonviolent Response to the Originating Violence of Nuclear Weapons at the Nevada Test Site. Now, before I introduce the speaker, Professor, my boss, Bill, reminded me that it's a very interesting coincidence that Father Hinane, Father, can you wave to everyone, was present at that Mass that was shown to us in the previous presentation. So it's very wonderful that we can connect with Don through Father Hinane. So the way we move in this presentation, after the presentation there will be two respondents, Professor Michael Bode and Professor Maria Clara Bingema will respond, and then we will have time for questions. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Ken Butigan. Sorry, I got my Ken Butigan teaches in DePaul's Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies program. He has published a number of books, including Pilgrimage Through a Burning World, Spiritual Practice, and Nonviolent Protest at the Nevada Test Site. He has worked for many years with Pace Ebene, Nonviolent Service, a nonviolence training organization, and has been a lead organizer in a series of nonviolent movements and campaign for social justice. So I will invite you to please join me in welcoming Ken.
Isn't this amazing?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for being a channel for this. We are at a crossroads. Humanity, the globe, Chicago, the world. We're at a crossroads. And we had people like Dom Hélder showing us the way. And we had his voice here. He is here in the room. We're at a crossroads, and I did many years of work around U.S. destruction and terrorism in Central America, and heard about gatherings like this where the troops would come in and take people off and kill them, and death squads would. And we are together in a gathering. We don't know what will happen tonight or next week. We know that if we stand up for justice, we will potentially be silenced. We will potentially be killed or jailed. But we will also be part of an amazing community. And we are very, very grateful. I'm very grateful that DePaul University has organized this venture to remind us about what is possible. And that's what Dom Hélder offers us. And I'm grateful that we have gathered. We should be 1,000 or 10,000. We are a handful. But as another great activist, Father Daniel Berrigan in this country, who worked a great deal for peace and justice, said, good things start small and get smaller. And when we talk about justice and peace, that's sometimes what happens, but it doesn't matter about the size. What matters, will we listen to these words? Say no to today's slave becoming tomorrow's slave master. Enough of slaves. A world without masters and without slaves. And I love this. Ask your son, speaking to Mary, ask your son that this celebration not end here. We're taking a couple of days of celebration of Dom Hélder. We ask that the celebration not end here. And this great phrase, it will be beautiful to experience the final march. It will be beautiful to experience the final march. And we get a taste of it, not only because of the immense courage and beauty of this towering 5-foot-tall giant, but everyone of us in this room has such power, beauty, intelligence, and commitment. And may we all be strengthened by one another this weekend. By taking part in this powerful gathering here at DePaul University, focused on the life and work of Dom Hélder, we might be tempted to think that we are simply lifting our glasses to the memory of this powerful seminal figure. We might simply regard this as a long overdue opportunity to honor and understand more clearly his life and work. We might merely declare Dom Hélder a saint and edifyingly be done with it. The heart of this temptation is as old as the Christian tradition and perhaps as old as our species. We have a bad habit of canonizing people in a way that separates them from the rest of us. That says, they are the exception. We idealize them, put them on the proverbial pedestal. Not only does this peel away the complexities and inconsistencies of a fully lived life, some of whom we heard about in the first presentation. He was a fascist for a while. The inconsistencies and ambiguities of a life and the growth of a life. But it also tends sometimes to be self-serving. It lets us off the hook. We can't be that virtuous, and we don't want to be that two-dimensional. In religious traditions, saints are often held at arm's length. We're glad that they're there, but we're also glad that we aren't there. But this anemic and ultimately stultifying vision of sanctity is not the only way to see it. Happily, this isn't the way Dom Hélder saw it. For him, the saintly life was both much more mundane and simultaneously much more sublime than conventional models have led us to believe. In this presentation, we will see that with regard to not only his passion for structural change, but the vision and method for change that he gradually came to embody, active and liberating nonviolence. This methodology was on display in many corners of his life, but in this talk, we'll examine it in light of the two journeys he made in 1988 and 1991 to the Nevada test site in the United States, the top secret 1,350 square mile U.S. government reservation north of Las Vegas, where 1,067 nuclear bombs were detonated above and below ground from 1951 to 1992. One explosion on average every 18 days. So first to this question of sainthood. In this presentation, I'll not go to the other extreme we sometimes do in this kind of discussion. For example, there's a lively debate going on in the Catholic worker movement about founder Dorothy Day, who is being canonized or in the process of canonization in the Catholic Church. Day herself hissed at one point, "Don't call me a saint." And some of those who have followed in her footsteps have echoed this imperative and opposed the Catholic Church's move to beatify her on the grounds that sainthood would be a way of dismissing or trivializing her. If Day becomes a saint, they ask, would the Church find room in its devotions to honor the civilly disobedient activist arrested repeatedly opposing nuclear weapons and other forms of injustice and violence, in addition to trumpeting the hospitality she offered to New York City's poor? Some have their doubts. At the same time, an argument can be made that sainthood does have a role to play, even if its ecclesial institutionalization has often led to a level of unreality that ultimately has little to do with the gospel or discipleship. Yet in light of the rash of papal canonizations and near canonizations, including the recent elevations of John the 23rd and John Paul II to sainthood, and just this week the designation of Paul VI as blessed, we don't want to advocate sainthood simply to even up the score between popes on the one hand and an archbishop on the other. At the same time, the notion of saintliness, while often hemmed in with these kinds of concerns and trivializing expectations, still has a place. People like Dom Hélder help us rescue the notion of sanctity from its false fronts, and to retrieve something of its original sense, as depicted, for example, in the book of Hebrews that declares, "We are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Let us therefore lay aside every weight, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us." In Hebrews, the cloud of witnesses is a metaphor representing those who have gone before us, who have completed their lifelong pilgrimage of faith, and now are cheering us on. They are both our supporters and our examples, inspiring us to be as relentless as they were, perhaps even to go further. Dom Hélder were here today, probably said, "You're going to do so much more than I did." Here there is no isolated, august figure being venerated, as sainthood is sometimes depicted. Instead, we see a growing crowd of fans who know a thing or two about running this particular track and who want us to cross the finish line too. They are not removed from the scene in the ethereal realm, but are still on the premises, rapt and attentive. This is more like the way, from what I can tell, Dom Hélder operated and how his spiritual journey unfolded. Engaged in the thick of the action, encouraging. He was loath to be skewered by the limits of conventional tropes of sanctity. There is, of course, the famous couplet that we already heard once tonight that amounts to a critique of this convention. When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're poor, they call me a communist. Sanctity here is safe, pious, and legitimate. Charity in this sense has always had a place in Christian practice, and it is something Dom Hélder himself engaged in relentlessly. But his spirituality was not confined to an important but often ultimately self-perpetuating act that tends to bolster the systems that spawn the need for such charity in the first place. Joe Nangle, a Franciscan priest who has spent decades working for structural change, tells this story contrasting the work of Mother Teresa of Calcutta with the work of Dom Hélder. For social activists who struggle against the underlying causes of poverty and oppression, Mother Teresa of Calcutta always presented a problem. Her undeniable holiness made it difficult to criticize this saint of the poor. Yet her refusal to address the systemic injustices that engendered the poverty she strove to alleviate never failed to disturb those whose vocation lies precisely in confronting these structures. Dom Hélder solved this dilemma for many of us more than 20 years ago at the Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia. During the course of a conference he gave on that occasion, the Archbishop, renowned as a voice for the voiceless, spoke of his desire to meet Mother Teresa. Dom Hélder said that day, and I paraphrase, "I hope to have the opportunity to encounter Mother Teresa and kiss her hands in acknowledgement of what she and her sisters do for the poor of the world." But then he added, however, a much more difficult and less understood vocation is that carried out by those who ask, why are the Mother Teresas of the world necessary? With both wisdom and simplicity, Dom Hélder has untangled this Gordian knot, direct service or direct action, by retying the two together, but also by putting it not on Mother Teresa, but on the rest of us, to ponder this great, weighty question. How is it that the world makes charity necessary? And what will we do, what will I do, What will each of us do to remake this world so that it is no longer required? This question. I love this question. This question is a koan. It's a goad, a summons, an interrogative that interrogates us. This question lies at the heart of the kind of saint Hélder was. He defines for our time, as Dorothy Day did, as Martin Luther King Jr. did, as Gandhi did, as Cesar Chavez did, and as millions of unknown women and men have done, a holiness evident in a wholehearted commitment to challenging and dismantling structures that crush, diminish, and destroy people everywhere. Hélder's powerful vision of structural change seems to be motivated by the infinite worth of all, and even the intimate connection between all. In such a case, even the image of the cloud of witnesses is not strong enough. There is still a distance between those up in the stands and those of us still hot-footing it around the arena's course. Instead, perhaps a more relevant image of sanctity can be found in theologian Elizabeth Johnson's contemporary reformulation of the Communion of Saints. While this term lent itself in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages to bolstering hierarchy and empire and patronage, the saint was the royal intermediary between humanity and the divine God, Johnson reframes it in a way that Hélder might have recognized. For her, the Communion of Saints signifies the relationship among an intergenerational company of persons profoundly touched by the sacred, sharing the cosmic community of life, which is also sacred. Ultimately, it points to the Creator Spirit who vivifies creation, weaves interconnections, and makes holy the world. Whether or not Hélder himself theologized in these terms, his spirituality of nonviolent action, healing, challenging, resistance, and love bespeaks a profound commitment to this inviolable circle of life. In this conference, we'll likely hear in great detail about the astonishing turning points, setbacks, breakthroughs, and transformation in Hélder's life. His birth in 1909 to a family in a Brazilian seaport, the death of 5 of his siblings in a span of 29 days due to disease and malnutrition, his ordination to the priesthood at the age of 22, his evangelization by the 4 million desperately poor people in the favelas of Rio, his installation as bishop in the early 1950s, his forming in 1952 the National Conference of the Bishops of Brazil, where he would serve as its Secretary General for 12 years, steering it to become the leading force for change in the country, his being named as Auxiliary Bishop in Rio, his formation of the first Latin American Episcopal Conference, Ceylon, where he would serve as Vice President during the tumultuous years of 1959 through 1965, his organizing massive programs to relieve poverty in Rio de Janeiro. But this was only the beginning. I mean, that would be enough for our job description and for our curriculum vitae. But that was just the beginning. As Vicki Kemper and Larry Engel wrote, Hélder soon realized that working for the poor is not enough. The church had to work with the poor, empowering them to work for themselves. Studying the scriptures, Catholic social teaching, and the writings of Gandhi, Hélder began to emphasize the dignity of the human person and the role of humanity as co-creators with God of the world and its human structures. The full development or liberation of the human person, mind, body, and soul, became his passion. He launched the movement for grassroots education to tackle literacy and helped form Brazil's grassroots-based community movement, which today comprises more than 100,000 communities. He brought the vision of a church to the poor, church of the poor, to the Second Vatican Council. And this brings us to this moment, in a way, because of the crossroads we're facing. We don't even know where we're going. All of this was prologue to the most intense, most powerful, and most important challenge facing his nation in his own work as an agent for nonviolent change. In April 1964, he was installed as the Archbishop of Recife and Olinda Olinda in northeast Brazil, just days after a military coup took over the Brazilian government. With 16 other bishops, he issued a call for justice and the release of jailed leaders. The next day, government troops raided his offices. As the attack by the military government escalated, with many priests and lay workers tortured and killed, Dom Hélder continued to speak out and face persecution himself. He was banned from public speaking for 13 years. From 1968 to 1977, newspapers in Brazil could not print stories about him. Nevertheless, as Kemper and Engel report, never one to be dissuaded by great odds or dangerous obstacles, Dom Hélder and the base community movement he inspired weathered 21 years of military dictatorship. During this period of threat and intensity, Dom Hélder led the church across the continent in grappling with the realities that millions in poverty face, including organizing the historic Medellin Conference in 1968 that formalized the Latin American church's preferential option for the poor. In a world facing the cataclysm of unjust economics, overwhelming oppression, and the monumental destructiveness of structural violence, we need the kind of saints that speak up and take action in innovative, dramatic, and powerful ways, like Dom Hélder and his innumerable co-workers. Many names on those roles throughout the world. What is the method? What is the method? One of Dom Hélder Câmara's most famous formulations for making sense of the cataclysmic conditions in Brazil is what he termed the spiral of violence in his 1971 book of the same name. Level 1 of the spiral is primary or originating violence, structurally ingrained social injustice. Level 2 is a reaction to the injustice, the revolt of the oppressed. Level 3 is the counterattack or repression by the powerful to reinstate their position, to keep their grip on a domination system. Dom Hélder's insight was that while level 2, an armed reaction to systemic injustice, is understandable, it actually serves to reinforce the spiral. The only way out of this script is to create justice. And this, he held, would only be accomplished through liberating moral pressure, especially in a struggle to free whole societies from a global spiral of violence in which, as he often said, 20% of humanity controls the economic life and death of the other 80%. For Dom Hélder, this liberating moral pressure was nonviolence, active and creative, challenging and transformative. This nonviolence was rooted in his spirituality. Through the withering repression of the military dictatorship, he deepened and broadened his call for nonviolent struggle. My personal vocation is to be a pilgrim of peace, he said. Personally, I would prefer 1,000 times more to be killed than to kill anyone. We need only turn to the Beatitudes, the quintessence of the gospel message, to see that the option for Christians is clear. We as Christians are on the side of nonviolence, and this is in no way an option for weakness and passivity. Opting for nonviolence means to believe more strongly in the power of truth, justice, and love than in the power of war, weapons, and hatred. This understanding of nonviolence came out of his own experience, study, and reflection. But it was also strengthened by conversations that he had with Jean Goss and Hildegard Goss-Meyer, nonviolence trainers with the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, who for decades crisscrossed the globe, spreading the methods and dynamics of nonviolence and nonviolent movements. The Goss-Meyers shared with Dom Hélder Portuguese translations of the works of Martin Luther King, Jr. As Argentinian Nobel Peace Laureate Adolfo Pérez Esquivel stated in a 1991 interview, in Latin America, long before Gandhi, there were nonviolent struggles. But Latin American nonviolence also has other origins as well. It has roots in the experience of Europe and also in the influence of Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King, and Jean and Hildegard Goss-Meyer. In recent times, the Goss-Meyers were among the first to promote nonviolence in Latin America through networking among many groups. They began from a gospel imperative, even as they delved into the methodology of the Gandhian struggle. They began to help Dom Hélder in Brazil. When he was an auxiliary bishop in Rio in the 1960s, they shared with him
what the strength of nonviolence was all about. Before that, he had used nonviolence almost intuitively. What Hildegard and John did was give him a clearer understanding of nonviolence and its history, showing him the possibilities and the capacity of nonviolence and its power in all societies and in all individuals. Now, I teach here at DePaul in the Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies program. And something like that, getting the information about nonviolence and reading the works of Dr. King, we do that here. But it's one thing to treat it as academic information. It's another one to act on it. And that's what he did in many, many ways. Dom Hélder did not regard this as academic information. He sought to explicitly put it into practice. On Gandhi's birthday in 1968, he launched the Action, Peace, and Justice movement, which sought economic, political, and socio-structural change throughout Latin America with a deliberate and explicit commitment to nonviolence, which it described. And I love this definition. I've come across many definitions of nonviolence, and I really like this one. Positive action, daring, and courageous assertion of nonconformity with unjust structure. That's a great definition of nonviolence. But nonviolence was not only a strategy for social change. It was a power deeply rooted within that he often embodied. I felt that power listening to his voice at the end of the last presentation. Embodied in his own experience of challenging the spiral of violence, especially in the midst of terrorizing repression and constant threats on his own life. Author John Deere reports this. Dom Hélder answered the door one day to find a man before him, a hired killer, gun drawn. "I have come to assassinate you, Dom Hélder." Dom Hélder responded with the equanimity of Gandhi. "Then you will send me straight to the Lord." Simple, poignant, fearlessness. For that moment, it confounded hatred and befuddled violence. Not that it's always going to do that, but in that moment it did. The man lowered the gun and let loose his tears. "I can't kill you," the man sobbed. "You belong to God." It's a method, but then there's action. Just as Gandhi inspired changemakers far beyond India, Dom Hélder inspired people throughout the world, including here in the United States. In the late 1980s, organizers for the Nevada Desert Experience were moved by the Archbishop's life of tirelessly championing justice to invite him to join them at the Nevada test site, where for several years they had been gathering several times a year to challenge the underground explosions of nuclear bombs. The initial contact was made by an NDE board member, Tom Shaboya, who recalls that he got a phone number from the Los Angeles Archdiocese for the Archbishop, which turned out to be his residence. He recalls that, quote, "It took a while to get a conversation with him. He'd been getting death threats, and so he was hesitant to talk on the phone. It was a combination of short phone calls, his limited English, my non-existent Portuguese, and then faxes. Finally, it was arranged for him to join the group in 1988. The Nevada Desert Experience was founded by Franciscan priests, women religious, and lay people who made the decision to mark the 800th anniversary of the birth of St. Francis of Assisi in 1982 with a 40-day vigil at the gates of the Nevada test site during the Christian season of Lent. This decision coincided with a growing worldwide concern at that time that the nuclear arms race was spiraling out of control. The Reagan administration, which took power in 1981, rapidly stoked the bellicose nuclear rhetoric of what one historian calls the Second Cold War. Ratifying the Jimmy Carter government's 1979 decision to station a fleet of Tomahawk cruise missiles and Pershing II ballistic missiles in Europe beginning in 1983 as a means of countering the Soviet Union's deployment of the SS-20 missiles, the White House announced a dramatic buildup in nuclear arms production and deployment, including its intention to build the MX missile, dubbed by President Reagan as Peacekeeper, to stockpile the neutron bomb, and to build 30 Trident submarines with each ship, and they're still floating in the waters today, each ship carrying atomic weapons capable of destroying 412 cities. The Reagan administration's initiatives not only sparked a quantitative increase in nuclear weapons, but a qualitative shift. Whereas the presiding nuclear theory of mutual assured destruction promised a balance of terror that served to deter nuclear war, the efforts of U.S. nuclear policymakers and weaponeers were aimed at deploying strategies of flexible use and nuclear first strike. The U.S. government touted the possibility of limited use of theater nuclear weapons in battlefield conditions, thus seeking to legitimate the possibility of crossing a fire break that since 1945 had been unthinkable. Hence its deployment of thousands of tactical nuclear weapons, some of which fit in the backpacks of U.S. infantry scattered across the frontiers of Europe and elsewhere. The Nevada test site played a pivotal role. At the time, I remember this very clearly, most people didn't even know we were testing nuclear weapons, deploying and detonating nuclear weapons in the Nevada desert. They thought that had all ended with the partial test ban treaty in 1962. But it was going on, it was going full strength. The Nevada test site plays a pivotal role in the design, production, and fielding of U.S. nuclear arms. Testing these weapons was key to their design and reliability of the nuclear arsenal. The Nevada desert experience began as a small ad hoc gesture, but over a few years grew into a key part of the global anti-nuclear movement. By 1988, the first year that Don Hélder visited the site, thousands of people were taking part in its powerful, spiritually grounded actions at the southern gates of the test site. And it was amazing because 8,000 people at the time were out there crossing the line, risking arrest, coming from all parts, not only of the United States, but all around the world. And Don Hélder was similarly a pilgrim to this site. When the first band of anti-nuclear pilgrims arrived to take action at the test site in 1982, they felt as if they were entering unknown territory. They simply didn't know what to expect. They did not know if they would be harmed by the police or irate workers. They wondered if their acts of civil disobedience would earn them years in jail. In those first arrests, for the first year or two, people did serve 3 to 6 month prison terms. They did not know if they would survive in the extremes of heat or cold that often characterized the Nevada desert. They thought about the challenge of maintaining and embodying nonviolence in this atmosphere. From its first days, NDE sought to create an atmosphere of nonviolent presence and rapprochement with the people running the test site. It was a very interesting ballet of nonviolent provocation and connection that they established. And that actually opened the possibilities for thousands of people coming out there because the atmosphere was very different than in a lot of other nonviolent protests. As I have chronicled in a book entitled Pilgrimage to a Burning World, this growing movement was not only spiritually edifying, but also politically powerful and played a key role in creating the conditions for the establishment of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1992. How'd they do it? To accomplish this, NDE blended traditional forms of prayer with relentless forms of nonviolent action, and did this at a key node of the national security state, which was largely hidden from view. It uncovered this reality and invited people everywhere to come and see it for themselves, and played a very important role, we don't have time to go into it, but a very important role in building people power in this country and around the world to create the conditions for what seemed impossible when they started out, the idea of the CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Making the journey to the Nevada test site came to be regarded as a significant spiritual and political act. And it would be actually interesting to think, where do we go today? Where do we go today that's both a deeply spiritual and a deeply political act to make clear our withdrawing our consent from injustice and violence? It was a way to register in a public and embodied way, one's disapproval of nuclear weapons by traveling to a location where those weapons were physically perfected. The fact that such a facility operated at all was thought to be a symptom of spiritual crisis. To actively protest the armaments there became a direct referendum against the threat they posed to the world. The spiritual richness of this conscientious action was reinforced by one's having to embark on a journey from one's familiar locations to an often strikingly different setting. In the case of those standing in the Judeo-Christian tradition, this was intensified by the lens of the desert. The legacy of the 4th century desert mothers and fathers layered this journey with metaphors of liberation, threat, emptiness, defying solace. Part of this was related to the tenderness and power of the terrain itself. It was to this site that Dom Hélder journeyed in 1988 and 1991. As he famously wrote in his book, The Desert is Fertile, he writes, "If we are to be pilgrims for justice and peace, we must expect the desert." Now, he's talking, of course, about jail, imprisonment, torture, death. But here he literally came to a desert. The vast Nevada expanse. But also to another desert. The desert of vast, originating, or primary violence. Enforcing the structural violence of economic and political domination and threatening the very existence of all that is. Why did the Archbishop, who could go anywhere in the world or could stay put, why did the Archbishop accept NDE's invitation to leave Brazil and come to the test site? Surely there were problems enough in his homeland. The answer is that in the end, his ministry was global. His vision did not stop at the borders of his country. Violence and injustice anywhere warranted a response, especially the structural violence of the machinery of geopolitical domination, of which nuclear weapons are a prime component, and of environmental destruction, which was taking place at the test site. As he put it in The Desert is Fertile, do not be indifferent to anyone's problems. Make the sufferings and humiliations of all your brothers your own. Live on a global scale, or better still, take the whole universe. In Nevada, he sharply focused this vision when he declared forthrightly, and this became this amazing hermeneutical tool for people organizing. For years after that, the test site is the site of the greatest violence on the planet, and therefore needs to be the site of the greatest nonviolence on the planet. With his presence, Dom Hélder meant to contribute to this nonviolent effort, to creating the greatest nonviolence on the planet. John Deere, author and priest, has written an account of the Archbishop's visit to the test site in 1991. Here's some of it. Some 1,000 peacemakers had gathered shortly after the First Gulf War, and there in the vast desert, snow-capped mountains in the distance, Dom Hélder stood in a circle we formed and offered a homily. He was a frail old man, short and rotund in his brown cassock and black beret. As he preached, his English sagged a bit under his heavy Portuguese accent, but his words lifted our spirits. "My dear brothers and sisters," he said, "let us make every possible effort to help love grow among humanity. Let us be an example to create strong families of love that help each other so that we can love one another. Let us live without war and be peacemakers, the true children of God, that we may never have opulent riches or degrading misery. Let us all be sisters and brothers, children of the same loving God, sisters and brothers of Jesus, our brother." And you hear so many accounts of his blessing. And here was another one. Then he laid aside his notes, removed his glasses, raised both arms to heaven, and called out, "My brothers and sisters, please, no more war. No more war." He lifted his face to the sky and cried out, "Dear God, we want peace. We really want peace." Then he raised his right hand, paused, and waved to the sky, to God. He had unabashedly given voice to our deepest yearnings and then turned away quietly, his head down, crying. The crowd, 1,000 people in the desert, the crowd gasped. It was an unforgettable moment. The homily concluded, and 75 of us proceeded to the line in the sand, the threshold of the forbidden zone. We stepped into it and submitted to arrest. And here is a reflection from a test site participant, Greg Pentosky, whom I interviewed for my book on NDE. There's a big, for those who haven't been to the Nevada test site, 1,350 square miles, and it's surrounded by barbed wire. And it's a top secret zone, so you are facing federal prosecution if you enter that. I tied one of my son Joshua's teddy bears to the fence. I thought of my lovely, gentle wife, Rachel, who died of lupus a year ago. Was she another victim of the arms race? We knelt at the fence line with a gentle, elderly lady from Los Angeles and began to recite the glorious mysteries of the Rosary. I wondered if the dust under us is radioactive as I dangled my arms and rosary through the barbed wire. Soon there were others joining us in prayer. After finishing our rosary, we watched the second and third wave of protesters doing more direct action. Some climbed through the fence and began walking toward Mercury, the Nevada test site administrative outpost a few miles away. Some were holding their children. Others sat and blockaded the road. No vehicles in and out. Archbishop Dom Hélder offered them a loving gesture of blessing, much to the delight of the crowd. In 1991, I was at the test site when Dom Hélder blessed us in this way. It was a profound experience to be with someone who had made one choice after another to face the terror of structural violence in Brazil and across Latin America, and who is now expressing his solidarity with the entire planet in this place, praying for a shift, calling for change, and simply being with the multitudes in the desert. He exhibited the spirit that Sister Carol Quigley, a missionary from Detroit who worked in Brazil from 1967 to 1975, captured when she wrote, "He really does practice universal love. He loves everybody, even those people who persecuted him, even the oppressors of the world. He tried in love to call them to love, to be the best in themselves." During this event, I was asked by one of the organizers, Ann Simmons Booker, to drive Dom Hélder and his secretary into Las Vegas to go get them some dinner. And I was thrilled to do this. This was the height of my social justice career, to drive Dom Hélder into Las Vegas. And look, the problem is, we just passed one casino after the next. And I think, I can't take Dom Hélder into a casino to eat. So we just kept moving. He was getting hungry, I was getting nervous, and we're driving along, and finally he points and he goes, there. I look over, McDonald's! And I said, oh no, Brazilian beef and the whole, it's a whole. And he goes, no, that'd be fun. I go in there, and I have this indelible image of him sitting at the table, having with his little Big Mac. He hardly touched it. He didn't really eat that much. And fries in his little cup, and happy, totally happy as a clam. And as we're driving back, we come to this place where you can see the whole valley. For those who've been to Las Vegas, it's this huge valley, and now it's just built up everywhere. So lights everywhere, but flat, sort of like Chicago, flat, except for the mountains are ringing it. And we're driving along, and he just raises his arms and blesses. He blessed every store we went by, every house we went by, every gas station we went by. He was blessing. He was blessing them. He was blessing them. He blessed us tonight. He's blessing. He's blessing us. He's blessing us now. I was moved to my core by the simplicity, profundity, of the presence of this person of faith and conscience, who decade after decade had risked his reputation, his status, his very life over and over, motivated by what Quigley called universal love and what it demands of us, and who is now focused
a longing for justice, peace, and the fullness of life for all the unknown beings in this valley, in this place, at the edge of a nuclear test site, and at the edge of Gamble City. Now, Dom Hélder is among the cloud of witnesses. Now he is part of Elizabeth Johnson's communion of saints. But in a new way, because we're part of that, and he's part of that. And now, it's our turn to deepen our own risky engagement for a world where everyone matters. And thankfully, he and so many others have shown us the way.
You will agree with me that that was a very inspiring, profound, and also personal narrative of some aspects of Dom Hélder that I, for one, I guess some here never knew. So I will invite you again to please put your hands together for Professor Butigan for this wonderful. And we're not letting you go yet, Professor, because we will have two respondents to your very inspiring presentation, after which we will invite people from the audience to ask questions. So the two respondents, I will say a few words of introduction about them and then invite them to speak. Our first respondent is Professor Michael Bode, who serves as Chair and Professor of Catholic Studies, Professor of Political Science, and Senior Research Professor for the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul University. He served previously as Chair of the Political Science Department and Director of the Center for Church-State Studies. His research focuses on interactions between ecclesiology, political economy, and culture. Among his most recent books are The Borders of Baptism, Identities, Allegiances, and the Church. Professor Bode has edited several other books and published in scholarly journals, including Studies in Christian Ethics, Sociology of Religion, and World Policy Journal. The second respondent is also known here, having served previously as a Senior Research Fellow for the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. And I'm talking about Professor Maria Clara Luchetti Bingemer. She is presently a professor, an associate professor of theology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, as well as the Vice Dean of the Center for Theology and Human Sciences. She is also a member of the FEDSA Advisory Council on Humanities with the FEDSA Institute in Kalamazoo. If I don't pronounce very well, you forgive me. In addition, from 2009 to 2011, she was a member of Caritas Internationalis Theological Commission. For 4 years, she also served as a member of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion and the former director of the Loyola Center for Faith and Culture at the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio. So I will invite first Professor Michael Bode, and I ask you please to join me in welcoming Professor Bode.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ken, for a thoughtful and most interesting introduction to the life and vocation of Dom Hélder from an unusual starting point. Near the end of his life, far from home, not quite a stranger in a strange land, but something close to it. A great many questions arise from Ken's paper, and doubtless he stimulated reflection and ideas among us who would gather here and celebrate as we reflect on what Dom Hélder's witness offers people in North America. My role here is to offer a few of these reflections in order to start the conversation in a way that allows Ken and the rest of us to broaden and deepen our exploration on this modern saint who is anything but a plaster saint, a harmless icon tucked safely into the corner of the chapel. In the interest of saving time, I will confine myself to 3 areas of interest, 3 places where politics, witness, and the way of the cross intersect in the person and journey of Dom Hélder. One of these is more specifically political, the other 2 are more ecclesiological and sociological. The first of these, as I listen to Ken's paper, makes me wonder about the transition into the present time, from the wars of Reagan to the wars of Obama. It's hard for younger people to understand the usefulness of Ronald Reagan for the peace movement, religious and secular, in its day. Reagan was shameless, unabashedly happy to be the herald and symbol of American militarism. He was of limited intellect, but he combined that with a boundless confidence and sense of self-righteous certainty, which made it easy to mobilize a counter-movement against persons for whom Reagan, among persons for whom Reagan was a frightening figure, an embarrassment, a poster child for global gunslinging and armed capitalism. Arms for hostages, Iran-Contra, drug running, lighthearted jokes about obliterating the Soviet Union, and the chilling fascism just over the horizon with his morning in America. Those are some of the fond memories that some of us take from the context of the Reagan years, and those were the contexts for activism and religious mobilization that suffused the long, long years of the Reagan administration. I wonder if Ken would share some thoughts on what Hélder Câmara would find on his return to the United States in our time. No presidential dolt from central casting at the helm, but a historical figure, a constitutional literate lawyer of impressive intellect and hitherto liberal credentials, who prosecutes wars worldwide without the bluster or visibility of Ronald Reagan, but smart enough to recast the bellicose rhetoric into one of international service and cooperation. We have more bases abroad now than we did under Reagan. We likely have more covert operations abroad than under Reagan, as far as we can tell anyway. And we have levels of surveillance and stealth killing worldwide that could only be the envy of Ronald Reagan and his friends. In what sand would Dom Hélder plant his feet these days? Where would they draw the line? And to what desert would they retreat when desertification itself is on the increase around the world? In a sense, I guess this question is an invitation for Ken to draw upon his lifetime study of social movements and resistance, to reflect on why such seems maybe less capable today than during the years of the Nevada desert experience. He may find that the premise upon which I move is unfounded, and it would be useful to hear his thoughts on that as well. Secondly, Ken's paper brought to mind the question of not merely the trivializing of sanctity, but the secularizing of the saint. It's an unvarnished good that since the Second Vatican Council, Catholics and other Christians have been reminded that God's grace, God's love, and God's wisdom flows to and through the world outside the channels of Christian thought, Christian practice, and Christian institutions. Such has been a necessary corrective to Christian triumphalism and a remedy for an unnecessary sort of theological narrowness, as well as a widening of the door to persons, ideas, and traditions that often embody some of the highest aspirations of Christianity, even if those aspirations are not named as such. Ken notes the ways in which such worked in the life of Hélder Câmara, and in the way in which he learned what gospel nonviolence and costly discipleship would mean from people like Mohandas Gandhi. In many ways, to a degree impossible to measure, Gandhi and a few other iconic figures like him, in some ways, at least in the West, in places like the United States, represent something of the Christianization of an exemplar from outside the faith, a reinterpretation of personality, character, and hopes through and into categories Christian origin, significance, and inspiration. As a Catholic, I'm happy to conscript Gandhi into the cloud of witnesses of the gospel movement, into the communion of saints that inspire, challenge, and accompany those of us who hope, however imperfectly, to follow the way of Jesus in our world, even as I recognize the ambivalence this causes some for whom Gandhi remains crucial, especially in his Indianness, his Hindu roots, and his secular political ideology. I confess to the same sort of ambivalence, if not downright dismay, when I see the hollowing out of Christian exemplars in the interest of making them more accessible, more relevant, or more inspiring to non-Christians and non-believers of all stripes. I despair of what America has done to Martin Luther King, the extent to which his Christian and biblical formation have been spray-painted away into just another nationalist placeholder, another symbol of the way in which racism has been vanquished in the United States. And if you believe that, see me for real estate sales later. Most of us here could offer a list of persons whose life, whose work for justice and for reconciliation make no sense outside the gospel sensibilities they inhaled and exhaled, but who nonetheless have been translated, trimmed, or otherwise truncated to be of service to persons and groups indifferent or hostile to the radical implications of the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount. I fear such could happen to people like Dom Hélder, as his story becomes more widely celebrated in North America and Europe. I want Ken to tell me why my fears are groundless. And finally, my third observation derives in part from the second one. Saints do not proclaim themselves, certainly not in their own lifetime. The saint who proclaims himself such in one's own lifetime, of course, is a charlatan, not to be taken seriously. To be part of the communion of saints, of the cloud of witnesses, is a matter of reception. It's a matter of deep trust that the exemplar puts upon the community he or she leaves behind. For Christian leaders and servants like Hélder Câmara, that community is the church. One of the things that makes the Christian idea of the communion of saints and the cloud of witnesses so deeply radical is that it reflects the fact that Christian martyrs die not knowing whether their death will be remembered and given purpose, or whether it is destined for obscurity, seemingly of no good and of no purpose to his or her cause or her co-religionists. So I wonder who and how Dom Hélder's witness will be received by today. To whom will this exemplar be conveyed and passed on in the cultural and religious ecology of contemporary North America? It seems likely that the initial reception of Dom Hélder's life and testimony in the later years of Dom Hélder's life, among the diverse and varied characters who gathered around the Nevada desert experience, that reception was very likely quite different from the cultural ecology that would frame such reception in contemporary North America for several decades later. 26 years ago, when Hélder Câmara first ventured into the Nevadan desert, the biblical and gospel sinews of his vocation would have been at least partially intelligible to most people, even unbelievers or non-Christians, and to those Christians there, based on the prior exposure to the culture of even an incomplete or acculturated sort of Christianity. I am not nostalgic for those times in any sense of wishing to restore them. But in our time, it seems clear that the near complete collapse of Christian formation in most churches, Catholic and Protestant alike, has made for a cultural soil in which receiving Dom Hélder and his witness is a difficult matter and a different matter altogether. Not that he will be met with opposition, but more likely perhaps with indifference or incomprehension. The degree to which persons under 40 years old have grown in and created a culture in which religion is peripheral or a matter of personal interest, akin to bird watching or stamp collecting, such cannot help but have implications for how Hélder Câmara's testimony will be received and kept alive. I wonder what Ken thinks about this generational question as he draws upon his lifetime of experience as a scholar, a teacher, and an activist. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, for your moving talk. Thank you, Kathy Elias, for the wonderful remembrance of the Missa dos Quilombos. For all of us Brazilians who are familiar with that, it was very moving listening to this here. And then the connection you made at the beginning of your talk with what we just heard of the Missa dos Quilombos. I will very shortly raise some points. The first is a very dear point for me, including as a researcher, a theologian. It's about the question of sanctity. I even, Danny Pilaris here, we just organized an issue on Concilium, he's on the board too, about sanctity 1.5 years ago. And exactly discussing this conception of sanctity that is a little bit the same, separated for humankind. And is exactly the contrary. The saint is deeply human, the more human, again, among men and women. Also, we're discussing the issue, the question of, we called, perhaps a little bit irreverently, canonization business. There are no lay saints because lay people don't have money to pay the process. Yeah, there are religious saints and priests because the diocese and the congregations have money to push on the process. And some canonizations are very quick and others last for long and infinite years. So it's very complicated to think of canonizing saints. So I understand very well that Dorothy Day rejected being called a saint. She didn't like the way, and although she thought saints were very important when she was pregnant, she would like that her baby had the company of saints. That was one of the reasons for which she baptized her daughter and she entered the church herself. But she had a little bit of difficulty with this calling a saint because she didn't felt one. And I'm sure that perhaps because of this distance between saints and normal humankind. The saint is the person who doesn't want to be apart from all the ambiguities and all the sins and all the sufferings, mostly, of the rest of human beings. On the contrary, saints have an attraction to be exactly in the middle of pain, of suffering, of difficulties, of violence. And I think the whole life of Don Hélder shows this a little bit, as the whole life of Dorothy Day too. And also, I think that there was a process, a gradual process of Don Hélder taking conscience of his ministry. He was integralist in the beginning, like the previous paper told us. And then he was very active in education, as a bishop, organizing the bishops' conference. He was a great administrator. But he has a moment in his life, I expect to speak about that tomorrow in my paper, where he feels that he has to turn his life to the poor. A French cardinal, Cardinal Thiollier, was very decisive to make him be aware of that. And from that day on, well, his life changes a lot. And also his option for the poor is always growing and changing. First of all, was to be with the poor, to be close to them, to feel how they live, to be with them, to eat with them, and then to see what they need and try to give them what they need. But afterwards, he begins to have a broader vision. It is much more, without ceasing to be a charity problem, a personal challenge to a Christian. It's a structural problem. So Don Hélder was really a pioneer in that, to understand that the church couldn't not deal with the problem of poverty and injustice as a structural problem. In that, I think he is very close and very attuned with his great friend Paul VI, who wrote this encyclical Development, Popularum Progressio, where he says development is the new name for peace. Justice, peace, injustice, and violence are together, all binded together. And treating one, you arrive to the other. And they are structural problems which challenge the Christians and all the men and women of goodwill, but very especially the Christians who are called then to collaborate with all the others who are aware of this problem in spite of being of any other religion and non-Catholics. So I think that Don Hélder was a prophet. He anticipated a lot of intuitions that the Vatican Council would deal with. He anticipated a lot of questions that with which we are dealing today. He anticipated, for instance, all the question of the interreligious dialogue. We saw by the Mass of the Quilombos, who was forbidden by the Bishops' Conference, where God is named by all names, and he recognized this many ways of naming God as legitimate, as true. And also with the indigenous, and well, it was a man who was open to everybody who wanted to struggle for a better world. So he anticipated a lot of intuition. And in this specific issue that you treat in your paper, nonviolence, I think he anticipated something that is more and more studied and reflected today, which is the concept of passing from a retributive justice to a restorative justice. Ronaldo didn't use this term, at least I don't know in his writings, this term, restorative justice, but it's exactly that he proposes, that he desires, and that he struggles for. And I think your narrative from the presence of Don Hélder in this experience in the desert shows that. He is there, and he wants that violence is erased from the world. And for that, he blesses everything, even the casinos, even the McDonald's, he is not a pure that doesn't touch what is sinful. No, he dives in it and wants that everything to be touched by this blessing, by which he wants to bring God to everyone. And another point, I think it's important, you mentioned in your paper, his ministry was global. I think Don Hélder is a figure in the 20th century, perhaps the first, or one of the first, who incarnates this thing of thinking globally and acting locally. He thought globally. He acted very locally. In Rio de Janeiro, he built the Cruzada São Sebastião. He did very particular and very located actions. But he was thinking always universally. So he was very good in organizing, for instance, the Eucharistic Congress in Rio, which was a great success. And it was exactly after this Eucharistic Congress that the French cardinal told him, you should turn yourself to the poor, you should open yourself more, not be restricted to one diocese. And it was true. Even when he was silenced and sent to Recife as a punishment, to be out of the great centers, to be in a city of the Northeast, then he began to travel. And his word attained the whole world. I was in Australia, invited by a series, you was there too, organized by a Marist brother with the Diocese of Melbourne, which is called the Hélder Câmara Lectures. And it started with him. He spoke in the Opera House of Sydney with 2,000 people there listening to him. A powerful speaker, a prophet really. His words and his presence and his intimacy with God are contagious. And he can transmit this and communicate as he could hear. even with technological resources. So I think for us today, your talk is very, very powerfully challenging, and we can learn from Don Hélder those points. Every Christian is called to sanctity, but a very human sanctity, not a sanctity that put us apart from the world and from our brothers and sisters. We are not called to pray the prayer of the Pharisee. I thank you, God, because I'm not like the other men, and not like this publican behind me. No, we have to thank God because we are like other men and women. No. We are sinners, we are limited, we are ambiguous, but the grace of God in us can make wonders and can bring us out of our own frontiers. The second thing, the question of nonviolence being treated as a restorative violence, a restorative nonviolence. Something that wants to rescue not only the victim, but with the victim, the perpetrator too. And third, to have this broader and this universal view. Development is the new name of peace, said Paul says in the Populorum Progressio. So, if we want peace, let's struggle for justice at all levels. In this, I think we are being a little bit disciples in the school of Don Hélder Câmara, this great prophet of the 20th century and for our times too. Thank you.
We shall now go to the question session. So Ken, I think as you answer the questions, you might as well also integrate some of your response to the respondent, but we didn't want to have another response to a response, right? So, yeah. So just in keeping with the spirit of the director of the center that we keep on moving the time a bit, we also hope you can accommodate some time for questions. So we would like to know those who want to ask questions, and we ask you when you want to ask the question to come to the microphone and speak clearly, so that also for the sake of everyone, but also for the sake of the record for this. So I don't know those who would like to ask questions. Okay, so if you can go to the microphone, introduce yourself, and then ask your question.
Go ahead.
I'm Sister Frances Ryan. I'm a daughter of Charity and Professor Roberta, and was in the Catholic Studies Division at DePaul. Actually, Ken, I really just want to tell this story. So Don Hélder Câmara was silenced, and at the end of his life, from 1994 to 1999, he was going into dementia. And he was greatly regarded by the Daughters of Charity, which I am, especially in Recife, and we had a great esteem of him. And so 3 of the Daughters of Charity were assigned to take care of Don Hélder Câmara in those last 5 years. And it was a great privilege for our community to do that. But, you know, just in the oral history of the Daughters of Charity, the sisters talked about how he returned to the poor, the garbage collectors. And he wrote simple poetry that was about poor persons of Recife and some of his memories. He was also made an affiliate of the Daughters of Charity, and if you ever travel to Paris, France, in our archives we have the testimony and the plaque of Don Hélder Câmara being an affiliate of the Daughters of Charity. Father Dan was telling me that he was also trained in the Vincentian Seminary, So we felt a real affiliation with him. And I just want to affirm what you were saying, Ken, about even his beginnings and his end were about the peace and the nonviolence that he spoke of.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Joe Scary, and I am grateful to Ken and everybody for a fantastic presentation. And my question is, I'm so intrigued by the statement, the test site is the site of the greatest violence on the planet, and therefore needs to be the site of the greatest nonviolence on the planet. I would love to know more about that. You said it was a hermeneutic that people who came after found very valuable, and so if you have time to tell us some more about that, I would really like to hear about that.
Yes, very briefly, 929 U.S. nuclear bombs went off from 1951 to 1992, and another 100 or so that we had the British exploding their bombs there. 1,067 nuclear weapons. Quite quantitatively, the most bombed place on the planet. No other place has received that kind of punishment. One nuclear bomb would be enough. Over 1,000. There are huge parts of the test site that no one can go into for at least 10,000 years. And so he meant it quite literally. It'd be good to ask where that place is now that we, as Michael was saying, what line in the sand do we need to go to? The thing I really appreciated about the Nevada test site was that it was a few people. And while it is true, the Reagan years, there was a kind of self-organizing, generating of a peace and justice movement, it still felt like we would never make any headway. And we also felt all the time that we were losing, and so on. And we may feel some of those things today. So where is that? What they did there was they said, oh, you know what? This is where we're going to come. And nuclear weapons are such, the nuclear reality is that they're everywhere and nowhere. There's no one place that you can point to the nuclear reality. It's not like a certain kind of violence that you can just point quantitatively to. They pointed to this place and they said, this is the homeland of the Western Shoshone people. This is a place that was stolen from them by the U.S. government, which is still true today. And this is a place that has been designing nuclear weapons and testing them and preparing the destruction of the world. And so we're going to say, we're going to come here. Could have been probably anywhere, because it's sort of like everywhere and nowhere. You know, almost the kind of pseudo-divine thing. And they said, no, we're going to designate this, and it's going to be both an obscene and a holy place. And we are going to come here and withdraw our consent. And we're going to do it with ritual, very deep, out of our traditions. And eventually it was interfaith. And people of no faith. And they created this amazing thing. So actually, I think what you're sharing, Joe, and also what you, Michael, are sharing is we're not off the hook. Where is that place now? It is difficult, perhaps, under the Obama administration to summon the same fervor. But myself and various people at the organization I'm part of, Pace Bene, we launched something just 2 weeks ago called Campaign Nonviolence, in which 238 actions took place in virtually every state across the country, in which people said it's time for an end to war, poverty, climate crisis, and the racism, sexism, homophobia, and economic injustice that crosses all of those. And they're saying it's not happening overnight, and it's not just one demonstration, just like at the test site. They realized, they went out there saying, well, we hope someday to see a comprehensive test ban treaty, but we can't say when or how. But we're so glad that Dom Hélder came to actually affirm this. And within literally a year of his second visit, the world promulgated a comprehensive test ban treaty. We have not sufficiently celebrated that. I always say in my classes, we don't celebrate it because we didn't get all of nuclear disarmament. And I keep waiting for the evite, the email, saying, let's have a party. It's an incredible accomplishment. And it did not happen because of Reagan or Bush. It happened because ordinary people like ourselves got ourselves to certain places and organized ourselves and created people power that helped move the power holders off their position. And the thing about the test site, it was this incredibly violent place, but an intense spirituality. The Western Shoshone spirituality, the Franciscan spirituality, the larger ecumenical Christian spirituality, and eventually there were Buddhist weekends and a variety of various religious traditions and no traditions that would come there. So I would actually say, I appreciate all of the questions because, all right, Dom Hélder, what are we going to do now? And what I'm learning when thousands of people 2 weeks ago went to the streets, and they did it in a very deeply spiritual way. There were festivals, there was yoga in the parks, there was interfaith services, as well as really powerful marches and rallies. For example, in Wilmington, Delaware, it took us about 4 months to try to find an organizer in Wilmington that would take this on. And finally, somebody said, okay, we'll take it on. They organized this unprecedented coming together of the predominantly African-American community in the inner city of Wilmington, Delaware, and the suburban, mostly white community. And they came together. They said, it is unforgivable if we don't do this. There's a great video about this. And we were inviting people to just begin the process. And we always said, and we are always saying, it's a long-term process. So anyway, I think, like Joe works on drones. I happen to know Joe in another context. He's an amazing organizer here in Chicago. He's working to say, you know, there's everywhere and nowhere are the drones. Well, where do we go to withdraw our consent? And then these ecclesial questions, how does the church begin to say, take seriously this restorative justice, this nonviolence, or as Dr. King called it, his definition of one of his many definitions of nonviolence was the love that does justice. So how do we put that into practice? And that's our challenge in a certain way. I mean, I have a vision that this, not that it depends on the Pope or the Vatican, but I would love to see an encyclical, Jesus and Nonviolence, that goes very deeply into this rich sense of nonviolence, not passive and running away, but something that would say to all of us, oh, you know, love your enemies is constitutive of the gospel. And where we're going to get to solving war, poverty, climate crisis, the epidemic of violence, we're going to have to go down this path. Well, until we get that encyclical, we get to do that. We get to make that kind of thing.
My name is Paul Husing. I'm a pastor of Old St. Mary's Parish here in Chicago. And you asked where the place is to go. The places are everywhere, really. But I would like to raise up one in particular. And I believe it was you who talked about the convergence of the Abrahamic traditions and the issues around that. And for me, one of the places is Israel-Palestine. And the tragedy there, where it seems to me every side has habitually chosen violence rather than nonviolence. And I'm just wondering, since this has been going on for so long, did Dom Hélder address this issue ever? And
does anybody know? I don't know that. But does anybody know if he specifically addressed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Middle East? It'd be worth looking into. I will say what is often under the radar screen are nonviolent movements in Palestine and in Israel. And those don't get the press. And yet, whatever peace does happen in these periods between the wars often at great cost of people who are challenging that injustice and that oppression. Now, I would imagine if you were alive, it'd be one of the places you would go. I can't say that for sure, but I know people like Archbishop Tutu has gone there because he knows he knows something about oppression.
Pope Francis.
And of course Pope Francis. So,
Yeah, I just want to mention with regards to this issue, the University of, forgive me, my feet are tangled with my, okay. The University of San Diego has a very powerful program, and the program is called the Women Peacemakers. I'm saying that because you can access information on the website at the John Cross Institute of Peace and Justice. And it happens that I come to know because I meet them, while doing work at school. So women peacemakers who come from Palestine and also Israel. Very powerful testimony. So people from the ground. These are not the big stars. These are not the big intellectuals. These are not the doctors. No, they are people who, out of their own will, desire, and motivation of religious faith, to get themselves involved in bringing peace. And they work with families, communities. It's a very powerful presence there. So the movement of peace and justice within Israel and Palestine is very strong. I also have connections with people working, Palestinians working in Tunis, the beginning of the Arab Spring. So I have kept communication with them, and it's a very powerful, strong movement, young people involved in work for peace, bringing all the faith communities together. So it's a big sign of hope.
And let me just say, each of us in this room probably has those incredible stories of hope. And that's what I also take from Dom Hélder. And also, just in the interest of full disclosure, I graduated from the USD, the University of San Diego, in 1978 or 1878, I'm not sure. and your work is so incredibly respected, Dr.
Yeah, I think you will all agree that this has been a very wonderful session, and we thank you, Ken, for your deep insight, and I ask you again for your